practices and what can be done about it. This event has been organized by the Center on Law and Social Transformation, which is a network of researchers affiliated with CMI, this institute, and the University of Bergen. So the modern globalized world, while having its many benefits, has led to the creation of certain mechanisms and structures which allow for some illicit practices like money laundering, transferring bribe payments, and evading taxes. These illicit flows represent billions of dollars of lost revenue and opportunities. And in many cases, these lost opportunities and revenues hurt the people who need them the most. Countries most dependent on revenues from extractive industries are also the ones that are the worst affected by these illicit financial flows. The extractive industries sector is considered one of the most prone to these flows, where the players involved are very powerful and big, and the stakes are very high. The last 2 decades have seen an increase in efforts by the international community to fight these financial flows, like the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention in 1997, the UN Convention Against Corruption in 2003, the Bribery Act from 2010 in the UK, and the Law on Transparency and Bribery in France from 2016. Despite these ambitious legislations, illicit practices persist in the extractive sector. So given this state, Sophie's book, about which she will be talking very soon, is timely and important. Due to its relevance and impact, I personally feel that the topic needs a lot of academic spotlight. And her book looks at some of the reasons why illicit practices still persist in the extractive industries. So the plan is that first I will stop talking and I will let Sophie take the stage soon, and she will present her book, and then we'll have a short panel discussion, and then we open the floor for audience questions. A little bit about Sophie. Sophie Lemaitre is a lawyer by training and a senior advisor at U4 Anticorruption Resource Center. She leads the U4's work on natural resources and illicit financial flows. Prior to joining U4, she worked for the UN and has previous experience from various civil society organizations. She will be presenting her book, this one and this one. It is published in French, and the English title is Corruption, Anti-Avoidance, and Money Laundering in the Extractive Industry Sector, The Art of Playing with the Law. The book is based on her PhD thesis in law, for which she won both the 2019 Ethic Award from the French anti-corruption civil society organization Anticorruption, and the Rhine Foundation's 2018 second PhD prize for the human and social sciences. And so, without further delay, I'll let Sophie take the stage.
If any one of you speaks French. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Shrey, I'm delighted to be here with you today to share some of the main findings from my book. As Shrey indicated, I looked at how companies, but also public officials, are being creative in how they play with the law and continue illicit practices. But since time is limited for today's presentation, I'll be mostly focusing on how they play with the law. And then during the panel discussion and with your questions, we'll look at what we can do about it. As a start, I'd like us to have a common understanding of what we are talking about. When we talk about extractive industries, we are talking about oil, gas, and mining. And when we talk about illicit financial flows, we are talking about money that is earned, transferred, or used in an illicit way. Here, what's important is the use of the word illicit and not illegal, because from a legal standpoint, illicit can mean that it's contrary to the law, that it's illegal, but it can also mean that it's immoral and ethical. So with that in mind, throughout my research, I looked at corruption, tax evasion, tax avoidance, to some extent, tax fraud, and money laundering in the extractive industries. Quick overview of the research. I analyzed 30 case studies around the world where illicit practices happened between 2007 and 2018. This is to show that it's not just a black sheep within a company, but that it's corruption or tax avoidance is still very entrenched and systematic in the extractive industry sector. I've conducted about 30 interviews with civil society organizations, but also extractive companies, judges, investigators, members of parliament, to understand the practices and what was happening in this sector. The book is organized around 5 chapters. You have the theme here, but for time's sake, I can't go through all of them, so I've made an arbitrary selection. I hope you'll be happy with that, but I'm happy afterwards during the question and answer to talk about the other aspect I would have discussed. So when I started my research, I asked myself, why do we still have illicit financial flows in the extractive industries while we have numerous legislations and initiatives that have been adopted over the last 15 years? And that's what you can see within this graphic. I'm sorry, it's based on the book, so the titles are still in French, but at least you can see the different legislation. And so when I did my research, I realized that what's happening is that the actors are being able to adapt and they're being creative. They find new ways to do business as usual. So now let's be a bit more concrete with 2 examples. The first one is related to beneficial ownership disclosure. So beneficial owners are the natural person who ultimately controls directly or indirectly the entity, the company. So it's you or myself behind the company. In terms of corruption, this is very important to know who's behind the company, because that way you reduce opacity and you can see if you have a politically exposed person having shares in the company. And so the last 6 years, there's been a push for beneficial ownership registries, public registries, where you could see who's behind the company. The thing is, with this, though we have now some public registries in different countries, we realize that they are becoming creative. And one of the possibilities is to restructure the ownership shares, because in most of the public registries, you would have a requirement to disclose your beneficial owner if the owner owns more than, for example, 25% of the company. So what they do is that they restructure the share to be below the threshold. That's one option. The second option is just to put entrepreneurial toddlers. And in the UK, for example, Global Witness has showed that 4,000 beneficial owners are under the age of 2. That's very clever. So that's also another way. The law doesn't prohibit having a baby of 2 years old having shares in the company. So that's how you can also put opacity in the beneficial ownership disclosure. What Global Witness also highlighted is that 5 beneficial owners control 6,000 companies. So they're very, very efficient businessmen. Another example can be related to anti-corruption program. Anti-corruption program are put in place within companies with the objective of preventing and mitigating corruption risks. They are voluntary, so companies may decide to put in place this type of program within their company, but it can be mandatory by law, like in the UK or France. And here I have a case I'd like to share with you. Unfortunately, I can't name the company because it's still under investigation, and I've had access to some of the documents. This is a multinational mining company operating in Africa, and it had what we could say an ambitious anti-corruption program, comprehensive, very robust. It had a code of ethic, a code of conduct. Staff was regularly trained on corruption risks. You had internal audits, and you also had a whistleblower system, alert system. But what happened is that despite this robust system, you had allegations of corruptions, and these allegations were shared with senior management on several occasions. And what's good is that it prompted investigation. So then you think, oh, the program is functioning, the different check and balances is happening. And yes, it did. They decided to fire senior management involved in the scandal, But what happened afterwards is that they rehired that person as a consultant to do the same job as the person was doing while it was a staff. And also the audit, what was leaked, is that the audit aimed not only to find who was doing the corruption, but who gave the alert. So it was a sort of witch hunting trying to find the whistleblower. So you can see how anti-corruption programs that are supposed to be there to prevent corruption can be used to go around, continue corruption, but also to look for the whistleblower. So reality can be different. On paper, it can look great, but then we have to check how it's put in practice. Then after thinking, okay, they are being creative and they are being able to adapt, but how do they do that? And then I realized that they are able to use what we call the legal and financial engineering, and that's what helping public officials, but also some companies to go around the law. And so that's what I'm going to look at it for the next two examples. The first one is related to complex ownership structures of multinational companies. What's interesting there is that you can have several layers of subsidiaries between the mother company and the one on the ground. So let's say the mother company can be based in Oslo, the subsidiary is based in Angola, where it has an oil permit, but between this subsidiary and the one in Oslo, you would have 15 layers of companies. So it's really difficult. To make it a bit clear, there's this example that was made by Open Corporate. They mapped BP structure. And so you can see there within BP at least 1,180 entities in 84 countries. And between some entities, you may have 12 different subsidiaries and legal entities. So that's kind of interesting. It's online, so if you want to check it, you can do it. They've done the same exercise with Goldman Sachs and other banks. It's quite interesting. And you also have this type of ownership, so I don't think you'll be able to really see in details, but that's the ownership structure of a mining company called BSGR. It was done by Public Eye, and what you see, well, or you can guess, is that you have this ownership is composed of trust, foundations, offshore companies, shell companies, holdings throughout the world. So once you have that, it's very difficult to find the link between the mother company and the subsidiary. So it's a way to distanciate the mother's company to the subsidiary and the illicit practices from the subsidiary. And if you have an investigation, it will be easier for the mother company to say that it's not her fault, that's the subsidiary. It cannot control the subsidiary's action. So it's a way to dilute the responsibility. I selected a case to make it a bit more concrete related to how complex ownership structure can help illicit practices, and this one is related to manipulating transfer pricing. It's happening in Zambia. It's with a company called Mopani. Mopani is held by two companies, Kaliza Investment, based in the Virgin Islands, and the second company is the Zambian state-owned company. There was an audit conducted in 2010, and that was leaked in 2011. And according to this audit report, shows the strategy put in place by the company to reduce its taxation obligation. And so the audit and the subsequent investigations, they show that Mopani would have sold copper to Glencore located in Switzerland at a price that is lower than the international market price. It did that through different subsidiaries, one the Virgin Islands and the Bermuda, and then you can wonder why doing that. Well, that allows Mopani to declare losses and so pay less taxes. But then in Switzerland, taxation is quite limited and to some extent sometimes no taxation at all. And then you can have the company that declare profits there. So that's one strategy, and this one is quite easy because you only have 2 layers, but you can imagine, as I said before, it can be 15. At the time of the audit, we didn't have this structure. So when the auditors conducted the investigation, they saw that there was strange things, but they didn't have the ownership. It's just later on with the investigation that they realized the different layers. One last aspect I wanted to talk with you, it's what I've called law havens. You probably heard about tax havens. I prefer to use the word law havens because tax havens are more related to taxation, but when it comes to illicit financial flows, it goes beyond tax issues. It's also about corruption. It's also about money laundering. So using the word law haven is a way to show how some countries, by their legal system, enable some companies and public officials in the extractive sector to seek the best environment. It can be legal, financial, judicial. For example, looking for a country that doesn't do a judicial cooperation. And so they combine several legal framework. Basically, they do the market. It's like you go for shopping and they shop the country, the jurisdiction, they like to make the different schemes. Of course, having an entity in law havens doesn't mean that illicit practices happen, but that raises legitimate questions. As an example, I've chosen the Netherlands. For me, it's one of the places to be. I could have chosen Dubai or Hong Kong and Singapore, but I've chosen Netherlands because it's part of the EU. So the question is, why going to the Netherlands? Clearly not because of the weather, but because it has many advantages. One of them is that it's a stable country with rule of law. So it's for a company that wishes to do business, it can be interesting to have entities registered there. It's not on the list. So it's not on a tax haven list. It's not on a non-cooperation jurisdiction list for money laundering. So it has, Netherlands have good reputation. But it also offers a neutral taxation jurisdiction, which means when, for example, dividends go away from the Netherlands, they're not taxed. So that's kind of interesting. They also have numerous bilateral investment treaties, so where you have a strong protection for investors, especially with an interesting clause for arbitrage. The investor-state dispute settlement is being used a lot in the extractive sector, so the Netherlands are a good place for investors. And they also have numerous tax treaties that were signed with at least 90 countries around the world. But what's interesting when you look at tax treaties is the content of these tax treaties, and most of those that were concluded with developing countries, they have favorable taxation treatment for companies. And in general, if I keep my example with the dividends leaving, let's say, Uganda, if Uganda had signed a tax treaty with the Netherlands, the dividends leaving Uganda would not tax. So at the end, you end up with a situation where you have no taxation at all. No tax from Uganda when the dividends leave, and no tax from the Netherlands when the dividends leave to go somewhere else. So it's a very interesting place to be if you want to invest. Now I have an example just to show you how the Netherlands are appreciated in the extractive sector, and this is about Total. So Total is a French oil company, and this is about its exploration and production entities. It has 221 entities in 29 countries that do exploration and exploitation activities, and 56 are registered in the Netherlands. It's about 25% of Total's legal entities based in the Netherlands. So, of course, I'm not saying that Total is doing a tax avoidance or tax evasion, but I'm asking questions. Why do you register 56 entities in the Netherlands while you could register entities in the country where you have exploration and exploitation activities? And if I take just one example of Angola, that's where Total has quite a few subsidiaries and permits in Angola. Most of them are registered either in Angola or in France. So why would you have entities in the Netherlands? That's something you can ask. A second question, or not really a question, it's more like a remark. What we've noticed over the years is that more and more legal entities are being registered in the Netherlands. So over the years, we've seen an increase about 20 to 25%. So if you look back 5 years ago, you wouldn't have had this number of entities registered in the Netherlands. I could say more about a lot of things, but I think I don't have much time. So I could have talked about commodity trading. We could have discussed the role of banks, law firm, looked at settlement agreements, stock exchange, and how we can manipulate stock exchange, but I don't have enough time for that. I would need hours, and I don't think you have that amount of time to dedicate, but I'm sure with the panel and then with your question, we can tackle some of these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie, for this super interesting presentation. So I read parts of the book. It's very, very nice. And like I said, the research question is very timely and important. So now we have a short panel discussion on the themes inspired by Sophie's presentation. And so our guests are firstly Lisa Rockner. She's a professor at the Department of Comparative Politics at the University of Bergen. She's worked on economic reforms, taxation, business associations, among other topics. And we also have with us Henrik Skar. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Law, also at the University of Bergen, and he leads the research group on tax law and has expertise on anti-avoidance regulations. So I'll just take a seat here now, I guess. So, Sophie, you're the main person here, so just feel free to jump in at any time and respond to any question. So I want to begin with Lisa. From your policy perspective, can you tell us a little bit about the trends and how the policies in the last 5 years have evolved? Also, and the maybe positive and not so positive trends in relation to illicit practices in the extractive industry sector.
So first of all, I'm going to be a little bit vague because I'm among experts, so you fill me in. But so I think I'm going to start. Okay, I'm going to start big. Every time over the Christmas holidays, you're going to see movies, and you're going to see movies with rich people. You're going to see handsome people in private jets. And I want you guys to think about something. How we idolize a kind of richness that it's not possible to have this kind of richness in a moral, legal way. And this is just my Christmas wish to you. Think about it. Think about all the movies you're going to watch. These people moving into these private jets and all that kind of thing. And we have. The thing is, what's going on? I mean, what is happening in these private jets? That's the biggest growing industry in this world. What happens in these jets that nobody checks? You don't go through pass control. You don't go through any kind of control. What is happening? What is being transported in these private jets? We can talk about weapons, drugs, and this is like thoroughly is like the most dodgy, illegal area in the world. And think about it next time you watch these movies. So that's where I want to start. The thing is, every time we need to think about this as crimes. We need to think about this unnatural wealth accumulation of individual people. We need to think about it as crimes, because there is no way to make this kind of money in a legal way, and we need to start thinking of this in a criminal manner. And then I want to talk about how. So then, from the other end, every time there is a new and good initiative, I've been reading, I was just thinking about the high-level panel of Thabo and Becky. Think about, in terms of tackling illicit financial flows in terms of in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a brilliant initiative, and it's really, what's wonderful about it is, for once, it's like African Union signs this. There's an agreement. There's a good process behind. All political leaders sign on to this. What is the problem? So the problem is that's great and that's necessary. But there are three problems underneath. The one problem is corruption. The other problem is, weak governance. And the third problem is just owning natural resources. It's in itself a problem. And so, just about do I have 1 second? You stop me. So one of the problems of bad governance is that you are always one step behind. You've managed to get some kind of consensus, but then you're still one step behind. And like you said, suddenly you think of a way of, you just move, okay, you split the company from 2 to 17, you add children to it, you shop for law. Think about that if you are a relatively, an emerging country with relatively weak institutions. Every time you train somebody, you train a lawyer to figure this thing out, that person, gets swapped up by a mining company or something. So it's a race, and you are always on the losing side.
So it's like a cat and mouse game where the governments are trying to continuously come up with these policies, and the firms are always one step ahead. That's quite, I think that's a very realistic depiction of what's going on. And so, for moving on to Henrik, could you tell us a little bit from the tax perspective about the major trends in Norway with respect to how tax evasion or tax avoidance cases are handled? And do we see any major changes since the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers?
This is a huge topic. It's not really easy to give a short answer, but if you can start with tax evasion, I'm going to give from Norwegian perspective. I don't know much about African countries and the extractive industries there, but in Norway we have, when it comes to tax evasion is when taxpayers misreport or lie to the authorities about their affairs and what they've done. That's illegal, of course, and also if legal advisors, lawyers help facilitating tax evasion, that's also illegal. If it's proven, it will be penalties, and in more serious cases, imprisonment. These main rules, these are old rules. We have had them since the modern times. But in recent years, like we can't speak of the last 3 years because you need to have a longer time horizon there. But like in the last 10 years, Norway has gotten a lot of information exchange agreements with a lot of countries, like also a lot of tax havens because of mostly pressure from US and Europe on the tax havens that they have to go into these agreements, or otherwise they start taxing all transactions that goes from that aisle. So we got a lot of these agreements now, and also it's automatic exchange of certain information, but they don't work perfectly because that's many reasons. But one of them is what you talked about, Sophie, that the taxpayers and the tax havens just adapt, so they find new structures and they have a lot of layers of companies. So you have to put together information from a lot of different jurisdictions to find out who is the ultimate owner on the top and stuff like that. So it's kind of, but it's a start, and we have to work more on getting more information exchange agreements, and then to put together all the information. So that's the recent development. I think the most important when it comes to tax evasion. And tax avoidance, it's like, then it's not about lying or misreporting income. It's more like finding arrangements so that you are outside the wording of the tax law, or the tax provisions. So you try to find loopholes. That's not illegal, and it's not illegal to give legal advice in Norway on how to find loopholes. But of course we have a lot of anti-avoidance legislation, which may result in, if you try to avoid the rule, this anti-avoidance legislation might be applied, so that you are taxed anyway if the authorities are successful in applying those rules. But of course this is like a cat and mouse game again, and it's not. So if you're going to talk about the extractive industry in Norway, like in the petroleum sector, it's like a lot of what you talked about, transfer pricing. Since the tax rates are really high on the Norwegian oil companies, we have 78% tax rates in the petroleum sector. Then they try to, when they buy services from other companies in the same group outside Norway, they just use pricing so that the costs get very high in Norway and lower the income. And we have this transfer pricing rule in the Norwegian tax law, which can be used to, the tax authorities can use to for tax purposes, change the price to market price. But then, of course, the companies get smart and they start using, when they don't, it's not like oil anymore that they use transfer pricing. It's more like intangible property and stuff, and which is difficult to find the market price on. So it's a lot of difficulties there. Yeah.
So I guess my natural follow-up question would be, do you think that there are any special areas which need focus, like maybe certain industries or jurisdictions? Maybe Lisa could begin. Or maybe
this sounds like totally something for Sophie and Henrik. I'll come in later.
It's kind of hard, but now at the moment, OECD has been working on a project called the BEPS project for some years now, and it's base erosion profit shifting is it called. And it's important for Norway to follow up the recommendation of OECD here and make sure that we do everything we can to like implement this legislation which they recommend. I think that's
Sophie, do you have any comments on this?
There would be plenty of things we could do. We could do more investigations and look throughout the chain of actors involved, and not just focus on the company, but also go for the lawyers or accountancy firms that are providing support. So you could go there. It's possible also to amend legislations, and for example, for some countries to renegotiate their tax treaties or investment treaties, so they can tax more about it. Well, I'm trying to think. Continue regulating, and then also pressure from civil society organization can help.
And Lisa, you...
I was just thinking, you know, when Henrik talked just from a Norwegian perspective, how complex it is. And this is a country that's relatively small with a very well-educated population, wide range of researchers, lawyers, and pretty good press. So just sort of transfer the problems that Henrik described to, you know, a different setting with much poorer governance structures, you know, weaker press, much fewer people with higher education, and then you can just, you know, sort of double the kind of problems that you see. And, you know, and just to give you, you know, the one example where you talked about the Zambian mining sector. So, for instance, Norway, our country, was very much involved in helping the Zambian government actually train tax experts to actually manage for the country to tax its natural resources, its copper mines, better, you know, to actually manage to get more out of its own natural resources. So this is a process that I followed over many years. And, you know, so there were all these people, so new lawyers, economists that, you know, was being paid by Norway, by NORAD, to get training. And they worked in the Ministry of Finance. So next time I came, they moved, you know, as soon as they finished their education, they were hired by one of the mining companies with triple salary, and, you know, so this is just, again, back to the cat and mouse. And the thing is, you know, you add a layer of complexity when we talk about low, you know, where so much of the world's natural resources are in settings in the world with poor governance. And so this is just, you know, we, like Norway, we're on top of this game, and actually we're part of the culprits. So, but so just to everything you say, you can sort of triple in terms of problematic areas.
That's interesting. And so you also mentioned this, the press and the media. So I want to move on to this idea that following some of the recent scandals, public opinion, so people have expressed a lot of discontentment against these illicit practices. And so do you think that there has been any impact of this public discontentment? Has this public opinion really changed anything? For example, from the tax perspective?
These scandals and Panama Papers and those things, I think they also have made a lot of taxpayers who have money and assets in tax havens more worried. So as I understand, they have had more report. They come back and report that they have money there, and then we have this tax amnesty thing in Norway. So if there's no investigation going on, you can report your income and your wealth which you have in the tax haven, and you are of course taxed, and then they go back in time and you have to pay interest, but you don't have to go to jail then. So maybe that's one effect, and of course the other effect is that we need to make bigger changes in the tax system. We need support from the public opinion, and that kind of scandals helps. Yeah.
The same question to you.
So we'll just sort of start with the Norwegian debate. I think it's something we should all think about, how much more morally outraged we are when relatively poor people are thought to actually sort of cheat on on social welfare, which turns out they're not even cheating. And then, but how we look upon sort of with much more benevolence on tax evaders and law shoppers, and if you think about the really rich people in Norway, and they don't play by the rules at all, and then we don't see this as criminal behavior. Whereas as soon as somebody actually gets a little bit too much from Nav, that's criminal. Really, we should think about our mindsets about this. And why is it? What creates these mindsets? Part of it is, of course, the press. The way the press sort of idealizes richness, and it's sort of it's something. It's quite mind-boggling, and to think about where the money is actually going. This you can amplify in a setting much more economically unequal, because in very unequal settings, richness is idealized in a completely different way. In films, movies, newspapers, reports, richness is God. And the press idealizes richness, and it doesn't really question how people become so tremendously rich. Then we have another problem. Where's the role of the press? So for some of the countries that I've looked at, that's the other thing going on at this point. It is how the press is being silenced, which is part of the democratic backlash. How there is much less space for an open debate. There's less space for civil society, and so a lot of governments are clamping down on civil society organizations like anti-corruption organizations getting funding from abroad. And funding from abroad will be necessary in order to do this kind of investigation, for civil society to follow these processes. So that's becoming more difficult. For instance, in a country like Tanzania, which is a very important country in terms of natural resources, this is a setting where both the press and civil society have, over the last 3-4 years, much less space to actually follow these financial flows. So that's a huge challenge.
And so I guess you've preempted my next question a little bit. So I want to talk about civil society organizations and how they have been very active in raking up the issue of illicit financial flows. But again, then we see that there's a huge backlash from the company's side. The lawsuits that are being used, called the strategic litigation against public participation lawsuits. So what is your opinion on the use of these lawsuits in particular to silence anti-corruption activists, journalists, and researchers in many cases? Are we seeing some dangerous trends, and what can we do to counteract these?
So should we all do that one, or do you want?
I want to start.
Yeah, okay. So because I know that Sophie and I had a great conversation about that, so she has much to say. But this is huge, because realize that these are individual people and organizations that are, they are relatively weak in nature. They are based on contributions, and then you have these huge companies threatening people. And sometimes these lawsuits, just to give you this, we call it slap lawsuits. And just think about this most the most litigation-loving person in the world. His name is Donald Trump, just to give you an idea. So many of these lawsuits that he files, and that he has filed through his company, he has no intention of winning or, this actually going anywhere. It's just to stop processes. And the cost of, for instance, for an NGO or an individual person to have to go into a law, into a law case like that, it's expensive, it's time consuming, and you got to realize they are up against companies who could just who have 25 lawyers or 250 lawyers at their hands and feet. So this is this is the cat and mouse in a very, very unequal relationship, and it's very, very threatening for individuals and NGOs. And it happens in the States, it happens in Europe, and it happens a lot in Africa. So this is. And the thing is, once, and it sort of has a kind of a self-censoring mechanism as well, because you see what happened to somebody else, and then you realize that you cannot do this. So this is big.
And so, Sophie, I want to know your personal opinion, like as a researcher, how much of a factor are these lawsuits when you're thinking about your research questions and you're going out in the field and doing interviews? And are there any other threats that we should know about?
Sorry. Unfortunately, I have to say that it has an influence. So as you said, I work for different organizations. One of them is called Sherpa in France, and it's a CSO composed of lawyers and legal advisors, and we used to do, they're still doing, litigation, so suing companies or public officials for embezzlement, money laundering, or foreign bribery. And in most cases, we got the lawsuits back, so a slap. And luckily in France, we have a limit, so you can be sued, but the maximum, if you are convicted, the maximum amount is 300,000 euros. It's quite a lot, but in some countries, like in the US or in Canada, it's unlimited, and it has had effect. There's an author called Alain Deneau, who's Canadian. A couple of years ago, he was sued by a company, by a Canadian mining company, and that ended up they had to settle and sign an agreement, and one of the impact is that the book is not available anymore in the market, so you can't find it. So yes, when I did my research, when you work on extractive industries, you are talking about money and you have a high stake at hand. I had to think about it and had to think of how to write my work, and this is a problem when, as a researcher, you have to really think carefully. Can I say that? If I say it, am I at risk of being sued? And so during my research, I never published anything. That was a way to protect my research and avoid risk of being sued. And we put embargo on my research for 2 years until the book was published. And I'm hoping this is not going to happen, but I'm not, though I've been very careful in the way I designed with all the reference. I know that even if you are careful, they still sue you, as you said. It's not just because they want to win, it's just a threat, so you will think twice the next time you want to write about it. And I can give you maybe two examples before I leave the floor to others. But one is this case of a French environmental law professor who was sued just because he commented a court case. The company was convicted, and he just did analysis. I mean, for every law student, if you're here, analyzing court cases is part of the job as a law student or as a professor. He was sued for defamation because he was commenting the court decision. And it's also known that there are companies, just because you mention the name, and one of them, I mentioned it earlier today, they sue you. So you have this, because you pronounce the name, even if you just say some suspicion, some allegation, they just sue you. That's a matter of principle. So we have to be, unfortunately, we have to be aware, and I think in the researcher community, we're not talking enough about it, and maybe not enough putting protection laws around the researchers to protect their research, and that's really important if we want the truth to be told, and if we want to have truthful reflections and debate around this important topic.
So I guess we need to be talking more about this issue here. But so now time is running out, and I want to have plenty of time for the audience to come in here. So just raise your hand and ask a question, please.
Where's that?
There's a really nice mic that you will get.
Just throw it. That's the whole point.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. I had a question for Henrik. We are colleagues over there at the law faculty, and I appreciated your comments also on how rules work here in Norway. Whenever someone reports on tax evasions, illusions, well, tax illusions, it was the Panama paper you referred to. There is no criminal sanction, but the person needs to pay interest on the sums, if I understood correctly.
Only if it's no investigation and no
Right.
evidence that he hasn't reported anything. If there's something in the Panama Papers comes out and that they have money there, then you can't come and volunteer, and then you have to then you are punished. but it's only if it's still no evidence and then no investigation ongoing, you can voluntarily disclose and there will be no sanction except of ordinary tax and it might be a little penalty, but not that high one. Yeah.
Since white-collar crimes or economic activities that are elusive in a way of redistribution are even more detrimental than, like street crime, if you look at the effects in the long term, why do we do that? Why don't we punish in a way that is not, going to jail, because we know that the whole process of jail rehabilitation doesn't work necessarily for criminal, white-collar criminal activities. But that's the same in Italy, and I'm really surprised by that. I'm Italian, right? And there is this possibility to get into some kind of arbitration with the tax authority, and you can even pay less than what you had to pay in the past. Now they're changing this, but why do we have this idea, perception that white-collar crime is more accepted? And we come back to Lisa, that's something that we don't even call criminal at times.
Exactly.
So should we do more with tax law field and criminal law? Because in this case, criminal would bring evidence on the real effects of all these activities. So this is just an idea. Thank you.
Very good point. Excellent point.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one of the things, if I may jump in, is to do awareness raising. I think if we look at doing a law school, you're not taught about ethic, you're not taught about the general interest, you are not taught about the impact it can have to play with the legislation. And yes, it does have an impact. It can have an impact on people's life, and if I think of, I'm French, so if I think of France, like in a couple of days we'll have a major strike because people are tired. There's no funds for public hospitals, for schools, for justice. So it has an impact, and I think one of the reasons you're talking, why don't we criminalize it, is also because there is a lack of awareness. You don't have a victim compared to a thief or a child being abducted. So there's this, it's far, far away. So we should do awareness raising, and we should use also other type of tools. Like we could, you're talking about Italy, but we could do seize assets, confiscate. You can, you just can tap into the money. But I think jail, I mean, this is a long debate, but it can also send, if there is imprisonment, it can also send a strong signal that it's not, you just don't buy your way out. And I think that's also important.
I think you had a question, maybe. Sybil, you can just chuck it in the front.
So there's
With the mic, yeah.
2 questions in the front. Syrian and...
Hi, my name is Vega. I'm a law student here at the law faculty. I was just thinking, isn't this illicit tax avoidance for the oil and gas companies a big problem for tackling climate change? Like, because they're keeping projects more profitable than they otherwise would be, and if like the renewable companies are playing by a different set of rules, isn't that like, yeah, a big problem? Thanks.
Maybe Lisa could.
I just want to say yes. Totally agree. And it's first of all, I mean, so my answer, if I treat it as a question, I'll say yes. But I also think this is again back to what Sophie was saying. This is part of this awareness raising. This is part of the way we think about it and talk about it. Everything from how we view popular culture to how we view newspaper debates, and I think back to where's the victim? I mean, we're all victims. You guys are victims. The children coming after us are the victims. And I mean, we need to sort of, yes, you're right. And to actually raise this, put it into a climate context, that's actually part of that awareness raising. So I totally agree with you. I suppose we should disagree for but let's not pretend.
So I have a couple of comments and questions. So one is on the extent to which the judiciary and judges are corrupted as well, and also the way in which I happened to sit in on a court case in Zambia last year, which was fascinating. It was against corruption activists, and one of the things that they had done was to say in a quite sort of relatively respectful way in a letter to the judiciary, saying that there is concern about sort of possible corruption by big industry and there was a particular scandal of the judiciary, and they were sentenced super hard to 6 years in prison for raising the criticism of the judiciary for being corrupt. And I'm just thinking about this. So that's one case, but I'm thinking this touches on several issues. It touches on the central role of, actually in many cases, a handful of judges to actually uphold the law in these cases, and the corruptibility of judges and the extent to which you see that as well, and what we're doing sort of in this context, but also the role of the judiciary in protecting in relation to these slap suits, which was not the case in this case, but you also see it to what extent judges are actually holding up against sort of big industry. And so that's one set of questions. And the other one is actually to Shrey. So your folks, I mean, you're also, I don't think you said, but you're also a PhD student researching corruption and corrupt behavior. And this sort of revolving door of how people are moving between different types of positions, which I think in Norway, that's it's a small country and people are revolving all the time, and many other countries are too. And to what extent this is also feeding these cycles, and maybe you could, both of you could say something, or all of you could say something about that as well.
So, Sophie, do you want to begin?
Sure. Yeah. In some countries, that's clear. There is corruption in the judiciary. This is one of the reasons why you have organizations that try to find jurisdiction in different countries. And why, for example, with the organization I worked for, we were having suing companies while the corruption took place in a different place, but that was a fora where we could put the case. So yes, this is happening, and yes, justice can be instrumentalized. And sometimes when there is a change in regime, and then suddenly lots of investigation for corruption, and then you look at who's being targeted. It can be for political motivation. But on the other hand, you have many prosecutors and judges that are doing their job, and despite all the risks and the pressure in country, being it in Angola or South Africa or Latin America, where they do the job, but they have to face constant pressure. In Brazil, with the change in regime, you have major corruption cases right now. At the moment, the judges still feel independent. They are protected by law, and their independence is protected, but pressure is coming through the budget. So you have more and more, the budget is being cut, and so for them to do this huge, and you said it requires a lot of time, a lot of money to get the information from the different jurisdictions. If you don't have a budget, it's hard, but then they can rely on other countries. So it's important to build alliances, and with the comment on lawsuits, well, in France, most SLAP lawsuit, the companies lost, and they had to pay for the cost of the judicial system. So you can get, but that sort of protection because you have to prove that you were in good faith and that you were not just talking like this. You have to prove that you had the document, but it can help. But in other countries, it might not be, you might not be as lucky, if I can say. You may not have the same treatment, unfortunately. I don't know if one of you want to comment on that.
No, I just want to say that, if actually you should be able to respond as well. So I was just going to say that, in terms of the judiciary, I think the case that you referred to, Siri, in Zambia, it's one of many, because so many places the judiciary is not independent, and it doesn't have, it really does it. It's not a kind of a in this, for us, in this case that we're talking about, it's not a benevolent player that one you can rely on to uphold. So that is again probably one sort of one aspect you could sort of file under the poor governance perspective. So corruption, poor governance, and the fact that you own natural resources are three of the major problems that emerging countries around the world are suffering from. So.
Want to add something, Henrik?
No, I think you're the expert.
You're the one. Now it's your turn.
My turn. Table's turn now. Okay. So like Siri said, I'm working on the revolving door, where people move from positions in the private sector to the positions in public sector, or vice versa. It's a huge problem, mainly because there isn't enough regulation to regulate this movement. So it's very easy. So because these circles are quite small, people who they go to the same schools, they have the same career starting point. So it's a natural question: am I going to be very tough on my friend? And so we need this external oversight. And I'm afraid, like in the US, they have regulation for this. So there's like a cooling off period so senators can't become lobbyists just right off the bat. But senators frequently don't disclose that they're becoming lobbyists. They just become consultants, but they do the same thing. So we're seeing we need very heavy oversight, and so the regulation that we have is clearly not sufficient. And I feel like there are, in many cases, this is a problem in many developed countries, and I don't want to think about how much of a problem it is in the developing world. So I think we have time for one more question from the audience. If anybody, yes, please.
Thank you, Arne. But there's something where Sophie started, to just a kind of perspective to it. Most of the countries we are talking about are actually based in Western countries. Most of the intermediaries assisting them in breaking the laws, advising of them, are based in Western countries. Most of the money ends up in London, Switzerland, Netherlands, countries with a strong, supposedly strong legal system. So how is that possible? It isn't. It is a problem with it, of course, the legal system in the developing countries, but I think we must have a much larger problem, since we are not either looking after the companies who are then extracting it, those supporting them, or where the money actually sits, because that's mostly in London and New York at the moment. So how can we work on those kind of legal systems? How can we somehow look at what Sophie also talked about, the international illegal flow of money? How can we address this? Because that's where really the big money is.
In a sense, that's that's where I started. Why I started with my comment about popular culture, because this, I think, is an issue of awareness. We're talking about climate shaming. We need to shame richness. This kind of richness coming out of these illicit financial gains in the Western world, because this is not only, I'm going to use this is not only stealing from the global South, stealing from the world's population. It's stealing from all of us, and this is the kind of, we should face it. We should confront this as criminal activity, and we need to really shame this kind of richness. You don't have to be like a super left-wing communist to see this. The world, we don't need billionaires. It's not natural for a person to be a billionaire. Bloombergs should not exist. Because this is just silly. Nobody needs that kind of money, and nobody gets that kind of money through, a legal, sane economic system. So we need to shame this, and we need to, really sort of raise awareness from conversations like this through, ethics in any university department, and actually really just, question this. This is just, it's the smallest word I can think of, but it's so distasteful, and then we need to, we need to start there. I totally agree with you, but we have to stop praising wealth. That was a communist talking. This is falling off. Somebody is telling me to shut up.
we can do that. I agree. Awareness raising is important. But to your specific question, if we think of banks, because that's where the money go through banks. So and they see it. So they have in place. They in the EU they have to comply with the anti-money laundering legislation. They have to put in place compliance and due diligence. So they are aware of it. Then they do send suspicious transaction or suspicious alerts to the financial investigative unit to tell what's happening. But what you see is that often they choose who's they are alerting. So it's no small fish, it's not the big fish, because that's their clients. So one thing is you can tighten the rules, that's one option, but the other one is investigation. And I think we forget, it's just we had a tendency just to look at the companies or the public officials, and we looked at from the countries where it happened, but not where that it's also happening, and I think we can do more. Civil society organization can play a role. Some organization can sue banks. That happened. The government of Nigeria submitted a complaint against JP Morgan in relation to the big oil deal in Nigeria. So they submitted a complaint in London for the bank for failure of due diligence. So you can do that. What we see is that most banks have been investigation for violating embargoes, but not for their role in laundering proceeds of corruption or in relation to tax avoidance. So there is still, or evasion, there's still a lot that can be done. But I think it's, again, about awareness raising. We can tighten the rules. We can talk about the law firms that they are regulated by themselves. That's the peer. And in many countries, there are no investigations into the role. So there's still a lot of things we can do. I know it's the end. I want to say one thing, because we said quite a few things that sounded pessimistic, but I want to be hopeful and optimist. And I think it's important to underline the role of civil society organization, investigative journalists, whistleblowers, because there's a lot of information we're talking about right now. It's because of what they've done and the information they share, but also public opinion. And that, with the Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, the public opinion being against this type of practices, that led some legislative change in the EU. The OECD, even if we can criticize the way OECD is reshaping taxation, but pressure can change. So we have to be hopeful and continue working.
I think that's an excellent note to end this seminar on. And thank you all for coming. I think the guests are going to be here for a while, so you can ask any questions.